All right, thank you everybody for hanging out through the end. I think I'm the last presenter, so I've done these things before at different places, and sometimes you're looking out into the crowd and there's like 3 people left. So I appreciate everybody staying through the end with me. I'll try to keep things interesting and get you guys some pretty decent information. I happened to be here for the last 2 presentations in a row, and from a catching perspective, you got 2 of the best guys in the game here talking. I just thought they were both fantastic. I take a lot out of the things when I get the chance to sit through presentations and hear coaches talk that are spewing out ideas that I hadn't really thought of all that much, or that I need to refine. And I always appreciate events like this for giving people like me an opportunity to get better and learn. Spent a whole lot of time listening to a bunch of presentations this weekend. They're all fantastic, so I hope everybody's gotten a lot out of it as much as I have. I'm going to talk today about development of two-way players. We'll go into a little bit of what kind of a sample week would look like. We'll go into an overview of kind of how to define these players. The main thing that I've seen over the last 5 years in coaching is we are seeing more of these guys. We're seeing more two-way players. We're seeing more really good athletes at younger ages specialize in baseball, which some might look at as a problem, and some might look at as this is just the way it's going to be from now on. I'm a big proponent of playing as many sports as you possibly can, but what you start to see is 15, 16, 17-year-old kids are going towards one or another, and they're really good athletes. And if you're 15 years old and you're the best pitcher on your team and that's all you're going to do, you're going to get a little bit bored. So you're going to go play shortstop, or you're going to go play center field, or third base, or whatever the position might be. And we're seeing more and more of that. And also at the college level, we're starting to recruit more and more of those players. One of the best players I've seen in college baseball in the last decade was a kid named Brendan McKay that pitched and played first base for Louisville, who's now doing the same thing in the Rays organization. He's actually a two-way player in professional baseball, which is incredibly rare. But I had a chance to coach against that guy for 3 years, which was zero fun for me, but pretty exciting to watch a player that's that skilled. I've been lucky enough to coach some really good two-way players along the way. The one of them that I'm going to talk about today was Will Craig, who was a third baseman, first baseman, right-handed pitcher, starter for his first 2 years and a closer, and was a 22nd overall pick for the Pirates in 2016, but I'll talk about him in a little bit. So getting into this, just as a general overview of what you consider what your standards are for a two-way player. For me personally, and any program I've ever coached in, and I'm sure it'll be the same at Arkansas as it's been at Wake and Missouri and anything along those lines, if you're going to be a two-way player at the Division I level in a Power 5 conference, you have to be outstanding at both. One can't detract from the other. So at the higher levels, like I said, Division I baseball, anything along those lines where you're starting to get into some high-level things, professional baseball is now maybe that's a thing. You have to be outstanding at both, and they can't detract from each other. It's not worth it if you have a guy that can pitch for you on Friday nights or hit in your 3-hole and launch 15 balls out of the yard to have him, be throwing a bullpen on Tuesday that might affect his ability to hit in a Tuesday midweek game. It's just not worth it unless he's outstanding at both things. Now, as that tiers down, you're talking about if you're going to a tournament and you got 17 kids on your team and 13 of them need to pitch to be able to fill the innings, that's a little bit different story, and you do need to develop those guys as two-way players also. So there's a tiered progression up the chain, and your realization is when you're 12 years old, you're going to have a ton of two-way guys. When you're 15 years old, it's going to shrink a little bit. 17, 18 years old, it's going to shrink even a little bit more. When you get into the junior college level, it's going to shrink even more. So you just have to start evaluating for performance as you go up the chain of baseball. And know the projected role for what you want these guys to accomplish before you decide, is this a good candidate to be a two-way guy at the next level? So if you're going out and recruiting or you're looking at a higher high school level, is this a shortstop that's making a ton of high-effort throws, and you're going to also ask him to be your Friday starter who's going to make high-effort throws on a Friday night and in a bullpen session on a Tuesday, Wednesday? Is that going to then affect his ability to make a throw in the 6-hole? These are things you have to consider when you're thinking about, do I want this player to be a two-way guy at the next level? The same goes for if he's, a third baseman, second baseman, shortstop, making a ton of throws as a position player. Do we really want that guy to not be at his best on a Friday night or a Saturday night in the SEC making pitches. Like if one detracts from the other, it's just not worth it if it's going to be at a super high level. Always know who's involved in the player. Know who you're building your team around when you're working with your players. Know your strength coach. Know who's doing strength and conditioning with the guy if you don't have a dedicated strength coach or you don't have a trainer or they don't have a trainer. Just know who's handling the strength and conditioning. And then know who is also doing assessments on your players. As you move into the higher levels, it's incredibly important. I've talked about it at length in a presentation earlier, and I'll show you guys some quick assessments towards the end of this presentation, that stuff that you can honestly do on your own that can really give you a good idea of what's going on. But know these people who are involved, talk to these people. Communication with two-way players is probably the most important thing you have, because you're talking about stressors. You're talking about stressful throws. You're talking about making athletic plays in the outfield or catching. We had a rare guy at Wake Forest who was actually a dual position catcher, right-handed pitcher, that was a nightmare to deal with in terms of managing the throwing. It's a total nightmare. But it's doable if you communicate and you talk through it and you have people that are putting safeguards into how many throws they're making in practice. Are they catching bullpens? Are they throwing the ball back during the bullpens? All these throws count. Every throw they make counts, and there's a cost for every single one of them. So as long as you're tracking what's going on and you have a decent idea of what types of stressors these throws are causing, that is the name of the game for developing these guys and making sure that you're not putting any undue area for harm, then also developing from a performance standpoint. A really good tool if you're working into the high school level a little bit and you got some guys that are a little bit higher level throwers. The Modus sleeve is a really good tool to monitor these things. They're like $150. I realize that's not cheap, but it's a really good investment. We put like 10 of our guys on them over the last 4 years at Wake and found some really interesting stuff. And we mostly use it with our two-way guys to find out stress on these throws, how the stress from the throw from third base, what that's doing from a total elbow stress or total shoulder rotation or whatever it ends up being, making sure we wrote that down, chronicled that, plugged that into our practice plan for when does this guy need to be making these type of throws, close to his bullpen, far away from his bullpen, close or far away from outings, his throws in pregame, in and out, those kind of things were all monitored, so we had a general idea of what they were doing. Again, it's not really all that expensive tool. If you have an iPhone, it connects right to your phone. You stand next to the player, spits out a bunch of information, plug it in into your computer, spits out a ton more information. They're really, really good tools for general throwing. They have some, if you're trying to publish a paper or anything like that, there's some limitations there, but the Modus sleeve in itself is a great tool. This is Will Craig. So if you were to see Will Craig you think like my two-way guy is going to be the best athlete in the world. Like this guy is just as likely to be eating donuts on Sunday morning than he is to be hitting a home run in an ACC game. I mean, it's not a great-looking athlete, but he was a phenomenal mover, very, very, very gifted. Again, started his freshman and sophomore year a little bit kind of a spot starter. Had some value, we thought, later in his career, so he continued to do it. Was always a phenomenal hitter, and his junior year accounted for, he had 10 saves and 7 wins. He accounted for 17 wins on the mound, and also led the ACC in home runs. I think he was second in batting average. Was the D1 baseball player of the year, national player of the year in 16. Was the ACC player of the year in 15. So an incredibly gifted player with a lot of skills, but needed management constantly on the throwing side. So that's what we'll get into and talk about a little bit more throughout this. Know the background of your player. Start with the background of whenever your initial contact with the player is, go backwards 5 years and find out what they've done. Write that down, have a record of it. For us at the college level, it's a little bit easier because we're recruiting these guys, so we have an idea of what they've been doing. We've been talking to them. But if you get a player that's new to your program, says I'm a shortstop and a pitcher, all right, what's the background? How long has he been throwing? How long has he been doing this? What types of programming has he been a part of? Has he had any programming? Has he ever been on a throwing program? These things are really important to write down and monitor and have a record of. You basically want to think about a player when you get him as a two-way guy, back and forth 3 years from today. Where's he been in the last 3 years? Where do you want to get him in 3 years? It's really important to think about things that way because it gives you some history and it also gives you kind of a long-term plan for those I already went over a little bit of what Will did his freshman and sophomore year, and his junior obviously was fantastic. One of the best things I've ever seen from a two-way player in my entire coaching career. So a sample week. I'm going to go through what a sample week would be for. This is generalized for Will, but it's also a sample week you could really use for any player. Friday nights, he would have his regular pregame work. He'd take BP, he'd play a long toss. He would do nothing different. Take in and out, play positionally at third base. Then he'd be available to close. So if the game was close, obviously that would be the position he would pitch in. He was never really more than a 1 or 2 inning guy for us, mainly because we were monitoring what was going on from the throwing side. But be available to close from a usage standpoint. You're looking at, if he's going to throw 2 innings, he was a lower pitch count guy, wasn't trying to strike a bunch of dudes out, pitch to contact with pretty elite stuff. So you're talking roughly, a 40 pitch outing would be kind of a lot for him. But you're also got to factor in that he did also make high effort throws on the way in his long toss. He did also make high effort throws in and out from third base. He did also make high effort throws in the game if he had to make a play at first base. He did make high effort throws as he was warming up. Again, monitoring these things, writing it down, every one of them is going to have some kind of effect on your player. So it's important to keep track of those things and keep monitoring. He would go immediately in after the game for his recovery work. You could talk about recovery for 3 hours. That's a convention in itself. Everybody's a little bit different in what they do. He was a little bit more on the side of wanted body work more than he wanted to do any kind of icing or anything like that. He wanted to massage, he wanted to get scraped, he wanted some kind of body work post-game. And having something for your guys that are doing this, that are in the two-way mold to do immediately after games is important. Not just sending them on like a 20-minute run or anything like that. Getting them into some aggressive rebounders, getting them into some maybe reverse throws, maybe some additional Jaeger bands or something post-game. It can be something as simple as that kind of get them in a healing mode from what they just did. Post-game, you got to identify usage. So we would always meet as a staff to identify kind of what the usage was for Will. Chart kind of like here's roughly how many throws he made. What did it look like in the bullpen? Is there somebody down there with him in the bullpen? There always should be. Monitoring when did he start going aggressive? So when did he start making high effort throws? And then how many did he make? Percentage of pitches that were breaking balls, percentage of pitches that were changeups, percentage of pitches that were fastballs. Again, we had Modus information on him and knew which pitch causes what stress for Will. So again, that's why I think Modus, if you have it, and if you want to spend $150, $200, great tool. What those pitches cost him. And then also the stress that was caused on an aggressive throw, backhand side, across the diamond. Like, what did that cost him? So now we know this is kind of the total number of throws. Here were the aggressive throws. Here's what happened from a pitching standpoint. Then you start looking at, all right, what type of pitches was he throwing? You hear all the time between low-intensity, high-intensity situations. It's more along the lines of, what he's ramping up to do. I know a lot of pitchers that with nobody on base and 2 strikes are going to try to throw it through the wall. That's a high-intensity pitch, whether there was people on base or not. I think people associate base runners with intensity sometimes. It's more important, depending on, your pitchers better than anyone else knows your pitchers. So I would monitor, how many of these pitches are thrown with 2 strikes? How many of them are 2-strike pitches where their advantage count, where a guy's kind of going for a punch-out? Those are typically, based on information, higher intensity throws, higher intensity pitches. Not that any pitcher pitches low intensity, but those would be on the higher side of the curve if you looked at Newton meters of stress in an elbow. And then last thing is get your coaching staff together, meet, and try to decide a general usage plan for him for the next day. Is he going to go back to third base? Was there not a whole lot of pitches thrown? Whatever it may be. So typical Saturday for him, and I'm going off of a 7-day week for a Division I athlete because that's what I do. So Friday night, Saturday, we have a game. He's going to come in early pregame and do a pregame lift in the weight room. It is basically a mobility lift. He's going to do some movement patterning. He's going to do some banded work. He's going to do some extra wall slides. He's gonna move a little bit. He's gonna throw some medicine balls. He's going to not really touch any. It's not going to be like a heavy dumbbell kind of barbell type back squat, deadlift, or anything like that. It's going to be a lot of movement patterning. It'll be a kettlebell circuit that they'll do. I'm actually going to show you a post-series flush that we do with all these guys in a little bit. But that and then manual recovery into the training room, get whatever manuals he needs to get done. Usually that was just taking him through some ranges of motion, doing some rhythmic stabilization, getting in, doing a little bit of massage. You certainly don't have to do that with a 12 and a 13-year-old, but get them moving before you actually ask them to do anything again. Have them show up, do a little bodyweight circuit at the field, 20 minutes before everybody else. I think it's a good shock for their body to kind of get them moving and get them ready to go for what they're about to do again. Regular pregame BP, he'd always hit BP, would not take in and out on Saturdays, did no in and out. And just played pretty much recovery catch. Recovery catch is something that our guys do with either light throwing motion, a 7-ounce ball, or just normal baseball with kind of like a lighter throwing emphasis. If he was going to play first base that day, we would not play him on the other side of the diamond, usually, if we pitched him the night before. He would probably take it out to about 150 feet, open it up a little bit, but nothing where he was going to have to make hugely stressful throws. The percentage of throws you make at first base that are really stressful are obviously lower than the other positions on the field. So we felt it probably prudent to just have him play just some decent recovery catch that day. He had option to play first base or DH. We happened to have a left-handed hitter that was on that team that year that ended up being a second rounder the following year after Will. So we wanted to get them both in the lineup somehow. So there was days when he played first base and the other kid could DH, and sometimes when we were trying to plug another bat in the lineup, we'd have to make some sacrifices, just tell him not to throw the ball from first base, which is odd in a conference weekend to just be like telling your first baseman to not throw or compete, which he never did anyway. But we always told him and made us feel better. Having the option to close, this is incredibly rare for him. We back-to-backed him in a regional, but in terms of, I think we also back-to-backed him in the ACC tournament, but we very rarely threw this guy back-to-back days. Mainly because two-way guys, the stress of playing a position, there's just so many factors. One of them was it was his draft year, so we didn't throw him back-to-back very often there just because we wanted what was best for him positionally and as a hitter. So, again, like I said, that was rare. You could have the option to close that guy 2 days in a row, depending on what your comfort level is, what your pitch count rules are, whatever that is. Recovery was a little bit more dynamic on the second day, where he began to throw actively throw some plyos, do some different things with, again, more rhythmic stabilization, a little extra band work. But to do some things that are a little bit more dynamic post-game to get him ready for the next day. Post-game, obviously meet with your staff, talk about a projected, this is what we might do with him, here's where we might plug him in. It might be the 4th to the 6th inning, it might be the 6th to the 9th inning, it might be just the 9th inning, it might be the 7th to the 9th inning, whatever your projected plan is for your player, then make sure your player has a general idea of what that looks like. Communicating and talking to them is really important, and making sure they know what kind of to expect, what possibly they could be asked to do the next day from a pitching and position player standpoint is always important. Sunday, he'd do a regular pregame work. He'd take BP. He'd take in and out. By the end of the season, he wasn't really taking it very often on Sundays, but at the beginning of the year, it was a pretty regular thing for him. And then modify his throwing program based on feel, kind of how he felt. Play positionally, he would play third base on most of those days, or DH, depending on how he felt. And then that second outing of the weekend was usually a pretty short stint for him. So it would be an inning, 2 innings, whatever. You can obviously adjust that with your players, what they're comfortable doing, what they're capable of doing. You guys know that better than anybody else. Then straight into recovery if he did or didn't pitch. And that would be a little bit more passive recovery since generally we didn't play on Mondays, so we didn't have to do anything the next day. Generally your tournaments are over on Sundays, I would assume, and you would have those Mondays off. So recovery can be a little bit more passive. They just need to get in there and do something, whatever that is for them. General plan for the week is really important to hammer that out Sunday, get it to the player, get it to your team, get it to your group, So they have a general idea of what's going to be expected from them going forward, when we project the bullpen might be. Are they going to be available midweek? Are they going to play positionally midweek? Those are all things to cover before you leave so that you have a decent idea of what's happening. And then the last thing is, once the weekend is over, whether it was a 3-game series for us or a tournament for you guys, write down the usage and find out like what the total number was. Like, what is the total amount of usage for this player for the weekend? So that can be something that you can refer back to, throughout the course of the tournament season or throughout the course of the high school season, or for us, it was throughout the course of our season. So we would know, all right, based on this weekend plus the last 3 weekends, this next midweek, he's just not going to be available. We're just going to do it without him. Based on the number of throws he's accumulated, the kind of stress he's accumulated, we'll do it. We'll get him hot for either next Friday or Saturday, depending on if he needed any more time. Monday was always no throwing for him. Only recovery work, light plyometric throws. Training room was just manuals. He's just going in there, getting some Graston done, getting some cupping or whatever he wanted to do. If you don't have access to those things, general movement, get him out there, do some bands, just get him doing something, even though they're not throwing. You just don't want to go to total atrophy for a day. In the weight room, you'd flush. So this would be a general idea of what a flush lift looked like. This was also something we would do for our starting pitchers. It's something we'll do. I've done something very similar to this for the last 15 years of being a coach. You're going to put them underneath a bar. They're going to squat that day. It's going to be pretty heavy movement patterning for the first 25, 30 minutes they're in there. And then they're going to move some weight. Weight on their back usually, or front squat depending on the guy. But they're going to move weight that day. And there's also going to be a metabolic conditioning circuit in there to try to flush out some of their body. Our guys really, seems like everybody I've coached over however long I've been doing this likes to get in a sweat the day after they pitch and doesn't like to run. So we take our weight room training very seriously, and how we dose that stuff out, how we limit their rest time when they're not moving heavier weights so that we can get some conditioning without doing too much running for our guys. I'm not a huge fan of going out and running a bunch of distance. I'd rather have some short, explosive sprints. If we're going to do that at all, we'd rather push a sled, we'd rather run stadiums, we'd rather do some weighted carries, something to get them moving, get their heart rate up. Eric Cressy actually did a really interesting study that's available online on, I think, maybe one of his blogs or something along those lines, that the average peak heart rate and average constant heart rate between a metabolic conditioning circuit and a 30-minute run, you'd actually peak your heart rate and get yourself in a better cardiovascular state from a metabolic conditioning circuit than you would from going and running for 30 minutes. I think that's going to change, if it hasn't already changed, pretty much everywhere. That I get the mental recovery of going out and going brain dead for 20 or 30 minutes, but from a physical standpoint, I think it makes a lot more sense to do something that's challenging, moving some weight, or challenging them with some, like I said, some pushing a sled, carrying something heavy, running up some stadium stairs, whatever you have available. So Tuesday, he'd go out and do his regular pregame work, long toss, play for third base, or emergency situation, usually only to close. That would be, if we had one midweek game, we had two. I based this off of a one midweek game schedule. Post game, this would be a situation where if we knew we weren't going to use him and we knew we still needed to pattern some work in, we would do our post game work. We would do our work post game. So we could go out, play positionally. As soon as the game was over, come in, throw a 15-pitch touch and feel, 10 pitches sometimes, 5 pitches sometimes. Just to get his cleats underneath some dirt going down the slope is really important, even if you're not going to use them. There's nothing worse than going 8-9 days without ever seeing a catcher, seeing a stand-in hitter, or getting something competitive. So it's really important to make sure that stays as kind of a regular thing for your guys, even if they're two-way guys and you think you have to rest them, that get them doing something. The mound work would obviously tear down as the season progressed, but we would always start out somewhere in that 15 to 20 pitch range and then kind of go down from there depending on what he needed. And you can do the same thing with your guys. Wednesday was off. This is if we didn't play a Tuesday, Wednesday. Wednesday is just a straight off day. In the weight room, he's going to do some dynamic pulling those days, something off the ground. It's usually a deadlift for him, but you could change that up to anything you wanted. any kind of dynamic pulling from the floor you would want. He'd press that day. You're talking about something from a neutral grip positioning. You wouldn't want to necessarily get any of your guys outside of 90 degrees from a pressing standpoint. You want to be able to press something neutral, especially to protect kind of the shoulder carriage for those guys and not getting into anything in kind of excessive impingement on the backside. And then accessory work. The rest of our group, especially our pitching group and our position group, would lift way heavier that day than our two-way guys. They're getting a lot more reps than everybody else. Is basically double the amount of work. So accessory work on those days is key. A lot more banded movements than pulling movements, a lot more kind of dynamic box jump type things, med ball throws, than actually physically moving something heavy. It's good from a recovery standpoint. Thursday was team practice. He'd do his regular throwing program. He'd have to get his ground ball work in. We usually did it without throwing, just to give him a little bit more time to recover from a throwing standpoint. He'd do the team segment. Sometimes he'd throw during the team segment. It was always just based on what had just happened. If we didn't use him on Tuesday, there's a better chance he was going to throw across the diamond on Thursdays. But it's something we definitely considered every time that we did this, every time that we built out a practice plan. And I think it's important for everybody that's dealing with a lot of two-way guys to build this out in their practice planning is what's expected of this guy in the next 3 days, and what did he just do? It's a pretty easy thing to do. Again, if you're tracking and monitoring these things, you're referring back to your Excel spreadsheet or whatever you're using. You're saying, Johnny threw 47 pitches on Tuesday. He's not going to throw again until Saturday, so therefore he won't do any throwing during team. Johnny threw 6 pitches and faced one hitter on Tuesday. Reported no issues. Looks great. He could probably do some throwing during team. It's really important to get your guys involved in practice. I understand that, especially if you're talking about a guy that's an integral part of your team, which most of these two-way guys are playing somewhere in the middle of the field, potentially, and they need to be involved in team practice. So as long as you're monitoring it, as long as you're making sure that everything's under control in terms of their workload, have them do some team stuff. It's not that big of a deal. Some of your guys, and at least some of my guys that have done this been two-way players, excluding Will, wanted to throw down the mound on Thursdays also, so you have to just monitor kind of what their workload is and make that available to them. And then he would take regular batting practice. In the weight room, it would just be a straight mobility lift, very similar to what he would do after he threw on Friday nights. So something very similar to that where it's not going to be too taxing, but it's going to get his body ready and move. So that was what a sample week would look like from Friday to Thursday. What do you do in the summer with these guys, especially if they've been high school guys that have done this? Like, let's say you have a high school guy that's been, a two-way guy for you all year. He's going to go out and play summer ball. What do you do with him? Assess everything before you send them out. Absolutely everything. Evaluate innings, workload, usage. How did you use him? Did you warm him up and not pitch him? How many times did that happen? What was his total usage number? And then you can kind of determine where he goes from there. We'll usually, one of the 4 or 5 times we'll assess during the season, we'll do it right after the season, do a full body assessment on all of the guys to determine whether or not they should be going out or not. This will help you determine kind of your shutdown time and the individual positional needs for your players. Because you still do need, every one of these guys that does this as they're growing up are still needing to develop. And one of the greatest ways to develop is, in addition to training, obviously, is to get out and do it and get out and play. And it's important that they have a plan for what that looks like. Does it look like he's just going to pitch? Does it look like he's just going to play positionally? Did he not accumulate enough innings? He can still do both. No matter the throwing plan, obviously you want them to continue to hit. So that was always a big thing. We'd say we're going to shut him down for the summer, not have him play at all, some of these guys, and then they would take 3 weeks off, do no hitting, come back and look like total crap. So we always made sure that that was continued to be something that was impressed upon them is, yes, you're not going to be playing or you're not going to be going out and doing anything, but that doesn't mean you stop hitting. Build up. So we would have, this is again a little bit dependent upon what would happen in the summer, but these guys would play positionally for roughly about 6 weeks of the fall. Based on their throwing schedule, they would do like kind of a modified throwing program. Most of it was just kind of recovery catch, honestly, to get them ready to play positionally. Full hip and shoulder assessment. The screening process will give you a lot of information in addition to potential injury, but like what's it going to do to his performance, like what's happening during the performance. So examples of that, like you want to look for limiting factors. Lead leg internal hip rotation or lack of internal hip rotation could possibly be something that leads to a little bit softer on the front side. This is really something to look for in two-way guys. Because not only is it important to land firm as a pitcher, but as a hitter, landing firm and having a stiff front leg that you can rotate against is incredibly important. So looking at that on the assessment instead of just what are the numbers, here's what the numbers could potentially lead to. Another one that we've noticed over the last probably 5-6 years, we've been really having a lot more two-way guys and having a lot more guys that we're expecting to do some things offensively, and it's not kind of just he pitches and then he could be like a pinch hitter. Like this guy is a dude on both sides. Is decreased total range of motion in the throwing shoulder, especially internal rotation, loss of internal rotation function, would lead to some less than optimal function of their top hand, which is something our trainer actually found out like 3 or 4 years ago. We tracked it, measured it against a bunch of different assessments, bat speed, average launch angle for the player was able to create during his shutdown time versus during what he was doing as a pitcher. So that's something to really look for. If you guys do end up seeing an assessment, you've got a little bit of lack of total range of motion in their shoulder, that's something that could affect the top hand of what they do as a hitter. So it's something to look for. It's something to be aware of. It's not everybody certainly, but some of the guys will display these type of traits. So here are 3 basic internal rotation hip and shoulder tests that you can do.
This would be internal rotation, and you're looking for.
This is the best in the business. Our trainer at Arkansas. You see the thing that is interesting about what he's doing is he's testing there. You can do this test a million different ways, but he's got our athlete seated at 90 degrees. That can change the function of the test. If you end up with an athlete that's not quite at 90 degrees, it can throw your numbers off a little bit. I can provide kind of ranges if you guys are interested in that. You can just get in touch with me after the presentation. I can provide you some numbers. This is a shoulder internal external. This is done totally passively. He'll take him through something aggressive first and then pull down passively. So this is just the main thing you're looking for here. He's measuring with a goniometer. You can do this based on kind of what it looks like. It's not going to be as accurate, obviously, but you'll be able to notice huge deficiencies. The one thing you want to look for is they're laying flat on their back, that their shoulder isn't popping up to try to kind of cheat the test. And the last one's external. Again, he's just taking him through something very passive right there and just letting his arm kind of fall, measure from the goniometer. You measure from the elbow down to be able to get an accurate measurement of kind of what those things look like, and then record all of this. So these are quick tests you guys can do in the training room. If you don't have a training room, you can do them at the field. As long as your guy's seated at 90 degrees, as long as you have a flat surface to go against, you can get these things pretty quickly. You don't need a training table and fancy equipment. It's done in this screen took a total of probably 5 minutes. Again, the things you want to look for if you're doing an internal rotation test, just a quick one to see what does a function look like, seated at 90 degrees, internal and external shoulder rotation, back flat so he's not popping his shoulder up to cheat the test, and let him fall passively. You don't necessarily want him to be cranking into external rotation to try to pass the test. There's no passing the test. You just want to figure out where they're at. This is incredibly important for two-way guys to just have a general idea of what's going on from a movement and a stability perspective. Building them up. After they're done with their fall practice, or this can also be done in the summer, take 6 consecutive weeks off from throwing a baseball. Week 4, you probably want to build into some plyos. Some rolling, some rockers, some kind of plyometric throwing. Week 6, actually begin throwing the baseball. Athletes shouldn't really be just tossing the ball out of the gate. You need some kind of a build-up for these guys. After the second week of the program, their throwing program, that's when you can pretty much get them start throwing the bases again, doing some active things. You don't want them to just play catch, go straight out to the field, start throwing the bases right away. It's a higher intent throw. They're just not ready for it after a shutdown time of We say 6 consecutive, but you guys can take as many. I mean, you can honestly take as many as you want off. Just the build-up time is going to be a little bit longer on the front end or the back end of it. Week 4 is kind of when they get back on the mound. And that does not mean that we're throwing full intent bullpens at week 4. It just means that at week 4, that's when we're comfortable. Let's put them back on the mound. They've had 6 weeks off. About 4 weeks of buildup if you count the 2 weeks of plyo throws on the front end. About 5 weeks, actually. And that, again, that doesn't mean a 40-pitch bullpen right out of the gate. That means something really small, 15 fastballs, whatever. There's stuff that we've done different things every year. Week 8 is about when they get back in front of hitters. So after they've completed a full buildup, you're basically doubling the time that you take off before they're ready to get any kind of hitter in front of them, like total time they take off. Again, week 4 is when you're throwing some plyos. So week 8 would be when they can get back in front of hitters. This is also when you can kind of blend in some more higher intent throws with them from a positional standpoint. So conclusions. I think the main thing that is really important with positional, guys that are going to play positionally and guys that are also going to be pitchers for you, is that you're giving them the best opportunity based on tracking. Like you're tracking what they're doing, you're giving them an incredible opportunity to do both and do it really well based on what you're able to do with them as athletes. And the other thing that we didn't cover a ton is the training. Like their training in the weight room has got to be different. There has to be concessions made for the fact that they're going to go out there and play shortstop or play third base and pitch. So there has to be concessions based on the training. In terms of the long-range plan for your two-way guys has got to be a lot different than the long-range plan for your guys that are just going out there and playing shortstop and that's it, or playing outfield and that's it, or pitching and that's it. So overall, this has been a great event. I really enjoyed coming out here, getting a chance to talk with a bunch of you guys in the breakout rooms afterwards, and also be able to talk in front of you. I thank you again for hanging in till the end, and I really appreciate it, and hope to come back up here soon. So thank you. Thanks, Dirk.